Hey guys, it's Pastor Kerry, and I'm here at the barn tonight with my friend Mike Philbin. So, it's a big group tonight, but that's all right, you know. But every once in a while we do our reasonable faith. I'm going to have to get a little bit more, I guess, consistent on this. That's probably why people don't come, you know. But or maybe they just don't like my style of teaching, you know. But tonight we're going to be looking at actually the final installment in our What If Atheism is True broadcast. And we're particularly looking at the implications that holds for us socially, both with regards to human rights and justice and also the law. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to invite Mike, if he has any questions, to just jump in and with any of those questions along the way. And if not, any of you folks who might have questions, feel free to jump in with those along the way too. But we're going to go ahead and start in with the presentation. So what if atheism is true is the question that we're raising. And we've gone through a lot of, I guess maybe looking at this from different angles. But right now, what I want to do is take a step back and define atheism. You know, there's not really a standard definition of atheism. A lot of people, say that atheism is the lack of belief in gods. Now, that version of atheism, I find I find it's really not that interesting, because it really tells me a lot about you as a person, but it doesn't say anything about the larger reality that we share. And so if you lack a belief in gods, well, cool, you know, but that doesn't say anything else about the larger reality. And so one of the things that I notice that atheists oftentimes like to use that definition of atheism because it really gives them immunity from justification of that lack of belief. And so, but I've noticed that when atheists deploy that definition, they oftentimes will talk about larger philosophical issues, like, for instance, they'll say that there is no evidence that God exists. Well, right there, they've jumped the fence from their own personal beliefs about God or gods, and they're talking about the larger reality out there. They say, well, there is no evidence. So they're really then are talking an epistemological, or they're raising an epistemological objection. There is no evidence that God exists, and so they get so they immediately like to say, I'm immune from defending my point of view, but I can go ahead and critique everything else. And I think that you can't have your cake and eat it too, you know, when it comes to atheism. So one of the things that all of us, whether we're a Christian or non-theist, we'll use the term non-theist because atheists bristle when you start to talk about atheism and defending their philosophy of life. So let me just pull myself off of the screen for a moment. All of us have we're confronted with larger questions about reality than just the does God exist question. And that's one of the things I've tried to take an inventory. I don't consider this to be an exhaustive inventory, but I've tried to take an inventory of all of the larger questions that are impinged upon this claim that there are no gods or God, and I've broken it into questions with respect to nature and questions with respect to human experience. And so some of them, and I've further refined it to inorganic and organic, and then also human experience with respect to individual and social. But we've gone through the implications of, well, if there is no God, then how do we explain the origin of the universe, the fine-tuning of the universe, the applicability of mathematics so this mental discipline of mathematics to physical reality. How do we account for the origin of life, the information that we find in all life, even the most simplest forms of life have a DNA code in them, the complexity of living organisms, and oftentimes the irreducible complexity where those components, the classic, of course, illustration is the mousetrap. A mousetrap doesn't work unless all of the components are working harmoniously. And how did all of those just somehow fit together in the development of that organism? And so, and then the diversity of life, and we moved on into consciousness, and how do we account for that with respect to the non-theist point of view. Then in our previous sessions, we've talked about rationality. How do we account for rationality if we are just molecules in motion? Morality, free will, purpose, meaning, value, and destiny. And we're wrapping up tonight with human rights, justice, and law. You know, for me, Mike, that when I first really began to give some serious consideration to this issue of human rights, justice, and law, it really hit me like a ton of bricks. And I started off trying to figure out, find good resources that would really inform my thinking on this. And I found some that have been helpful, but I haven't found as many as I would like to on this particular topic. So I'm just going to kind of share with you some of my thinking on these three big questions about human rights, justice, and law, and the implications that if there is no God, then how does that impact those three areas of our social experience? And so let's start off with this matter of human rights. And here's a question that I think that's worth raising is, what about human rights? What's the basis of these rights? And I think that these types of questions are important to ask because, you know, if we all, and it doesn't matter, atheists, theists, non-theists, conservatives, liberals, everybody believes that there's human rights. Well, where do these human rights come from is the question that I'd like to kind of explore. And that how do we account for the human rights within theism or within a non-theistic point of view? And so Thomas Jefferson, you know, one of the things we're kind of at this place, let me take myself off the screen just for a second again, is that we're kind of at the place in our culture where our predecessors, particularly in America, is that we love to point out their hypocrisy, and rather than thinking in terms of the principles that they taught. And there's very few people that I know that can withstand that type of scrutiny. Even Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is that when you come to his personal morality, it was pretty suspect in a lot of areas. But that doesn't discount his message of racial equality. And so with respect to some of our founding fathers, who were also, by the way, products of their generation and their time, it's not as if that they just had this ability to transcend the thought of their age and deliver principles of philosophy and truths that are timeless, I guess, apart from their culture. And so, but I've never found a better statement of human rights than the one that Jefferson espouses in the Declaration of Independence, where he says, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." And I want to circle back to that term in just a minute about this idea of self-evident. is that we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men, and of course, the critics will say, well, what about women, and so on and so forth. But I believe he was using that term in that context in a more generic way of mankind, that all of mankind, that we are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable, and we hardly ever use that word unalienable. We'll look at that in just a moment. But unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And as I said, I think that you'd really be hard-pressed to find a better statement of the foundation of human rights than the one that Jefferson offers. So I guess the question that I have is that are these truths self-evident? He says we hold these truths to be self-evident. And are these truths self-evident? And what about the equality of humans? Because one of the things that is painful, that we become painfully aware, is that we are not equal as humans when it comes to your mental abilities to understand electrical, electrical repair and construction. Is that I sometimes don't know which end of the wire to hold on to, but you're a guy who's worked on massive projects. And so there's not a lot of equality in humans with respect to our talents and our abilities and our intelligence and our looks and our health and so on and so forth. And so, but are humans, even though we are every human being is unique, are we fundamentally equal in certain ways? And what is the essence of that equality? And do we truly possess unalienable rights? And that brings me to the question of what does this word unalienable mean? And that unalienable simply means that it refers to that which cannot be given and given away or taken away. So that it's a right that I have that cannot be given away or taken away. Now, immediately, that we raise the objection. Well, certainly the state can take away your life, and they have in the past. And so, is this a fundamental human right? Or certainly the state can take away my freedom, my liberty. And so, is this a fundamental human right? And that brings me to another point that I actually discovered in preparing for this talk. That's a point that the ACLU talks about, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But let's go ahead and we'll take God out of the picture. And if God is not the source of our rights, what would be? If God, it becomes a pretty short list. That if God is not the source of our rights, then what would be the source of our rights? And some people might argue that the state would be the source of our rights. But how could we have any unalienable rights, that which we couldn't give away or be taken away, if the state confers rights on individuals? And this is really where I see that we're moving more and more in our culture and our society, is that as God gets pushed to the periphery of our awareness, that something is going to fill that vacuum, and the all-powerful state is what's going to step in and fill that vacuum. But I'm always reminded that what the state gives, the state can take away. And even nowadays, it seems that more and more that the state really believes that it has the power to infringe upon our rights as individuals. And so, as I mentioned, is that in preparing for this talk, and I thought I would never say this in any teaching scenario, but I find myself in agreement with the ACLU on this. And the ACLU says this, that we have certain fundamental rights. Now, we have human rights, but there are also certain fundamental rights that are even, that are like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that those are not our fundamental rights. There are rights that are even more basic than those. And according to the ACLU, the Bill of Rights guarantees that the government can never deprive people in the U.S. of certain fundamental rights, including the right to freedom of religion. Freedom of conscience, I think, is a fundamental right, is that no government, no person can stop you from honoring your commitment to faith or your conscience. And that's, by the way, you notice as the state becomes secular and atheistic and totalitarian, and that's one of the first things that they want to get rid of is the freedom of religion, and free speech. There again, that this is a fundamental right. The state never has the right to take away our free speech. And the ACLU also says the due process of law. I was thinking about that, and quite honestly, I think they got it right. You notice in the Bible, in Acts chapter 5, verses 28 and 9, that when the apostles were when the church was new, and the apostles were preaching about Jesus, following his resurrection from the dead, the religious authorities, who were also the secular authorities in Israel, they had at least a degree of secular authority there in the land, they ordered the apostles to quit preaching about Jesus. And we read in Acts chapter 5, verses 28 and 29, it says, "We gave you strict orders not to teach in this name," he said, "and yet you filled Jerusalem with your teaching, and you're determined to make us guilty of this man's blood." And then Peter and the other apostles replied, "We must obey God rather than human beings." And I think, once again, getting back to what the ACLU said about fundamental rights, is that the freedom of conscience, the freedom of religion, is a right that we have, that it's certainly appropriate to defy the state in exercising that right. Now that doesn't mean that we don't have any regard for the state and its laws. Even here, for instance, as in order to operate as a tax-exempt charity, we have filed our 501c3, a nonprofit corporation status, and so we operate within the confines of our laws. But you live in a culture where Christianity was completely outlawed, but that doesn't mean that I've lost the right to exercise my conscience. We see this, by the way, in Daniel, in the Old Testament. Everybody knows the story of Daniel in the lion's den. What they may not remember is how he got himself in that mess in the first place. is that the state, the all-powerful totalitarian state, that the royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and governors have all agreed that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except you, I think that was, I can't remember if that was Nebuchadnezzar or Darius, is one of the two. But he says, except for you, your majesty, they shall be thrown into the lion's den. So the state had issued this edict that it was impermissible to pray to any other god or to any other human being other than the king of Babylon. And it says, and now when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, I love this passage of scripture, by the way. So when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened towards Jerusalem. So it wasn't like he was hiding in a corner somewhere. He opens up the windows, and 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. And so certainly the state can issue decrees where they seek to curtail our fundamental human rights, but that does not give them the right to take those away, and we are still within our rights to continue to exercise those. But also like what the ACLU said about due process. And what that means is, in particularly here in America, that in the Bill of Rights, Amendment number 5, is that no person shall be deprived of life. So talking about our other rights, that no person should be deprived of life, liberty, or property. So there are these fundamental rights. Free speech, the government cannot deprive us of that. It cannot deprive us of freedom of conscience and also of due process. Is that, but the government can deprive us of our life, our liberty, and our property as long as due process is followed. Now, this brings up the whole issue of justice, as we're going to be talking about in a moment, justice and what constitutes just law. But I think that it's important for us to start off this discussion on rights and give consideration to that. So how do we end up with rights as humans? Is that it's certainly not from the state, because what the state can give, the state can take away. But as I think the ACLU rightfully argues, that there are fundamental rights that we have that even the state can't touch, at least not legitimately. And then, so what about nature? Did nature give us these rights? But my question would be if only natural processes are at work in the world, then how could a natural process confer upon us a right? You know, it doesn't make any sense. A right's in an entirely different category than a natural process. And so a right is, according to definition, is a moral or legal entitlement to have or obtain something or to act in a certain way. And nature has no interest in moral or legal entitlements. It doesn't address those matters. So it seems to me that if we exclude God from the picture, we're only left with a couple options on where we can base human rights on. One would be the society, but we've seen that there are certain rights that even transcend society, and the other one would be nature. But if we're just these molecules in motion, if that's what we are as human beings, then how do we account for this odd phenomenon that everybody believes is true, and that's rights? You know, we have rights. And so here's a guy, as a matter of fact, he's a philosopher who he argues that we actually don't have any rights. You know, he says, the truth is plain, there are no such rights, and belief in them is one with belief in witches and in unicorns. Every attempt to give good reasons for believing that there are such rights has failed. Natural or human rights are fictions. You know, by the way, he'd be the first guy to complain, you know, if you took away his rights unjustifiably, is that, but nevertheless, and here's where I'm at with this, because I've read a lot of books. I haven't read a ton of books, but I've read a lot of books on this topic, and I've gone to a lot of, I've watched a lot of YouTube videos, and I've read a lot of articles, and I kind of have landed at the place where Jefferson landed, and that is that rights are self-evident, and we can see the justification for rights in Christianity. that's one thing that Christianity has going for it that non-theistic religions or philosophies don't, is that in Christianity, the Judeo-Christian value system is that all human beings have common dignity. We're made in the image of God, male and female, right in the start, by the way, is that we're all made in the image of God. As we're told in Galatians 3:28, that there's neither Jew nor Greek, so those ethnic divisions, neither male nor female. So the differences in, when it comes to our standing before God is not a matter of our biology or gender, is that a slave or free. I think there's a couple other ones in there, barbarian, Scythian, can't remember, but slave or free. The point is, or our social or economic status. And none of that is really what's definitive when it comes to our dignity and value, according to the Bible. And according to the Bible is that all persons have value, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, you know. And so we find that all human beings are valued by God. And so I think that, getting back to this issue of how do we ground our human rights, I can't see how a non-theist would do it, you know, because you end up with the complications of either resorting to the state or trying to argue that somehow evolution or natural processes created our rights. But I just don't see how either one. I see that both of those are not fruitful explanations for our rights as individuals. And so here's where I've landed on this, and I tend to agree with Jefferson. And it's quite possible that these rights are self-evident. You know, that there are certain truths that are just plainly self-evident, and when you try to demonstrate that they're true, there's no propositions you can use to get to them. There's certain foundational truths that are self-evident, and they are not able to be justified beyond the mere assertion that they exist, that we have rights as humans. However, the person who denies them would be on the same footing, in my point of view, as the person or the individual who says there's no moral absolutes. I don't think that the burden of proof is on me to demonstrate that there are no moral absolutes. I say that the burden of proof is on that person who claims that there are no moral absolutes. And so rather than granting, for instance, rather than granting even, you know, a highfalutin philosopher that teaches at some university somewhere that rights are fictions, instead of granting them the benefit of the doubt, we should regard the skeptic of fundamental human rights to be defective and unworthy of serious consideration. You know, I just think that some of these things, and I've read actually some really long books that I found to be very boring, you know. I'm trying to get at the justification of these, and I just didn't find any arguments that I felt were just so compelling. So right now I'm kind of at the place in my life where I think that maybe it's just self-evident that humans have rights, and people who say otherwise are not to be considered, you know. So we're talking about this scope of real experiences that both the Christian and the non-theist has to account for. And not only does reality confront us with basic questions about human rights, but also the nature of justice and the foundation of law. And boy, this one is really where it hit me hard, and it's actually hit me even harder over the last few years. But let's just walk into this. Let's talk about the question of justice, because it seems that so many people in our culture today, and I think rightfully so, are concerned about justice, and particularly justice under the law. But I don't think that they've really given much consideration to the foundations of justice. How do we know what justice is? And how do we know what just laws are? So what is justice? And what is what is what is legal necessarily just? So can the government pass laws that are fundamentally unjust? Well, I think America has on plenty of occasions, and I think actually some U.S. laws that have been passed and that are currently standing are fundamentally unjust. And just because something's legal doesn't mean that it's just. So the question then is, what is the foundation of justice? And there's a Roman statesman and also philosopher, Marcus Tullius Cicero, and I've never heard a better definition for justice than the one that he gave, and that's that justice renders to everyone his due. So, if I sought to relieve you of your vehicle, you know, that would be an unjust thing for me to do. But if you were behind in your payments, and I had an order from the company that held title to your vehicle to retrieve it, it would be within my right. I would be acting righteously to steal your car. You know, if I could get away with it on your property. So justice renders to everyone his due. And so how do we know? That's an important question to ask, is how do we know when a law is just? Just because the Supreme Court says so doesn't make it so. You know, there's been a lot of laws that the Supreme Court has ruled on. One that, and I don't want to get stuck in a legal quagmire, so I'm using one that's a historical reference, but Plessy versus Ferguson. In Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, the U.S. Supreme Court decided that they upheld the constitutionality of racial segregation under the separate but equal doctrine. And as a result, Jim Crow legislation and separate public accommodations based on race became commonplace. And that was law in the U.S. for, I can't remember for sure now. I think it was 64 years. I'd have to double check. But nevertheless, is that Dr. Martin Luther King, when he came along and challenged and practiced civil disobedience, that I've never found a better explanation of how we determine what laws are just and what laws are unjust than King's explanation in the letter from Birmingham jail. And he writes this: one may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? The answer lies in the fact that there are two types of laws. And this is so important. King really got this one right, in my opinion. He says there are just laws and unjust laws. I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One not only has the legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. And so, of course, you can already anticipate the next question coming up is how do we know the difference between a just law and an unjust law? And that's what King writes about in this letter from Birmingham jail. He says, now, what's the difference between the two? How does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares, now notice King's foundation for determining just law. It squares with the moral law or the law of God. You know, people always say, you can't legislate morality. And I always like to ask them, well, what should you legislate if you're not going to legislate morality? You know, I mean, the reason why we have laws against murder is because it's fundamentally immoral. Theft, you know, laws to promote honesty in contracts is because these things all have a moral basis to them. Or what are you going to legislate? Just mere opinion? Now, I do believe that we can legislate mere opinion, but that shouldn't be the foundation of our law, as I'll explain in just a minute. So, King goes on to say, an unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law. And so King believed in the priority of eternal law and natural law. And when he's talking about natural law there, he's not talking about the laws of nature. He's talking about essentially how we are imprinted and how we are created as human beings to determine what's right and wrong, you know. And so I guess maybe to a certain extent the human conscience. And so that brings us to an understanding or a discussion of positive law versus natural law. And as I said just a minute ago, is that I do believe that you can legislate mere opinion. Like, should we drive on the right-hand side of the street or the left-hand side of the street? Well, you know, in Britain and certain other countries, that they drive on the left, and here in America and on the continent and so on, they drive on the right. And there's not a moral foundation to that, what's called positive law. It's just a matter of the government exercising its authority in order to secure order within, you know, the boundaries of the state. But natural law is quite different, because natural law begins with the premise that all of our rights come from God, as we talked about previously, or nature, and are inherent in our being. And when we're talking about nature there, we're talking about how we have been created as human beings. We know that there's something fundamentally wrong with taking the life of another without sufficient justification, or taking the property of another without sufficient justification. And so there's something imprinted naturally, I think, because we're created that way. So that's what it's talking about when we talk about natural law. But positive law believes that our rights are granted by the government, like, you know, for instance, even the right to drive, to operate a vehicle. Well, that's certainly granted by the government. It's not like I have a human right to that, you know. And so it's positive law is our rights that are granted by the government, society, or other men, and therefore it can be taken back by them. So the government, I drive drunk or fail to obey the laws, they can revoke my license, you know, and I can complain, but that's not going to make a difference. So the Bible talks about this concept of natural law, that and that this is the. Remember, we're trying to figure out how can we determine what's just law versus what's unjust law. And Dr. Martin Luther King said that just law always squares with the eternal law of God or natural law. And the Bible talks about this concept of natural law in Romans 2:15. where it says, they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them, and at other times defending them. And so we are imprinted as creatures made in the image of God with a moral sense of what's right and wrong. That doesn't mean that our consciences are an infallible guide, because the Bible also teaches that we're fallen creatures. That's what, by the way, why I believe in limited government, is because everybody who's operating our government is also a fallen creature. And one thing that I've noticed, that whenever political leaders start talking about equity, the person that they always exempt from equity is themselves. They always get to be the fat cats whenever in that equation. And so there's a fellow by the name of Sir Leslie Stephen said that if legislature decided that all blue-eyed babies should be murdered, the preservation of blue-eyed babies would be illegal, but preserving those blue-eyed babies would still be the right thing to do. And so society cannot be, it just cannot be the final arbiter of what's just law. We actually have a case of this, with Moses, in the birth of Moses, when Pharaoh says we're going to throw all the babies in the Nile, and Moses' mother arranged for his safety and defied the Pharaoh. And even the midwives, they defied the Pharaoh, that they didn't kill the male babies. And so there's an authority that's greater than the state. And I know that that's really a radical concept in our culture today, but nevertheless, it's still true. And so, but however, I can't see the non-theist who has any tricks in their bag to say that that here's the authority that's higher than the state. They've just run out of explanations. But you see, non-theists too must account for the various features of reality, and their accounts are not very satisfying when it comes to particularly things like what's the basis of human rights? What's the basis of justice? How do we know what's truly just? And what's the basis of just law? And so think about it. With non-theistic worldviews, we cannot find a secure basis for human rights and just laws. What we find is that the state reigns supreme and wields its power to serve its end. And that's something to think about. And so that brings us to the end of our consideration on what if atheism is true. We've gone through a lot of all these previous, considerations, aspects of reality that, we looked at and we thought, well, if atheism is true, how does it impact those? And we wound up tonight with talking about rights, justice, and the law. So that's it for the broadcast. And so I'm going to sign off, and I hope you'll catch us next time. Bye-bye.